most people would think that perhaps this was revealed to the Prophet ﷺ around the time of Surah Al-Fath, where Allah Azza wa Jal had given the Prophet ﷺ the good news of the reopening of Mecca, of the conquest of Mecca, and the promise of Allah materializing. Maybe it came at that time. Maybe it came somewhere around 6-7 years after the hijrah of the Prophet ﷺ, where things were starting to look in a certain way that victory was imminent. Maybe it's about rulings of Hajj, or maybe it's about the preparations that the Muslims have to make. But Surah Al-Hajj was actually revealed in the time when Hajj was least possible in the life of the Prophet ﷺ and the companions. And there are many surahs of the Quran that came down as a reassurance to the Prophet ﷺ himself. إِنَّ الَّذِي فَرَضَ عَلَيْكَ الْقُرْآنَ رَادُكَ إِلَى مَعَدٍ. So many different verses that came down where Allah is promising the Prophet ﷺ himself that you will return to Mecca. Because this was, at the end of the day, a personal affair to the Prophet ﷺ that also was personal to the entire ummah of Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. إِنَّا فَتَحْنَا لَكَ فَتْحًا عَظِيمًا. We have given you a great opening, O Muhammad sallallahu alayhi wasallam. But there are verses that came down as an affirmation and to console the believers as a whole. Surah Al-Hajj was not revealed 6 or 7 years into the advent of Medina. Surah Al-Hajj was revealed, some of it between the time that the Prophet ﷺ was being expelled from Mecca to the time that they were just really waking up to the reality that here they were in an entirely different land, and everything was stacked against them, and the possibility of them going back to Mecca seemed like the most far-fetched imagination, where people who had lived their entire lives in Mecca, and even if the Hajj was performed in a way of ignorance before, would have all of this nostalgia of the days of the pilgrimage every single year. Some of these companions were 40, 50, 60 years old. That means for 40, 50, 60 years old, the Kaaba was the centerpiece of their lives. They would see the people come from all over the world in their Hajj to the house of Ibrahim, the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, raised by Ibrahim alayhi salam, that had been corrupted by the idols. And now they're in a strange land. And Allah reveals Surah Al-Hajj. How can we be talking about Hajj when, just from a people flow perspective, everything is looking outward and not looking inward? By the way, it speaks to the audacity of some people to speak about a free Palestine right now and a free Masjid Al-Aqsa when Gaza is on the edge, when the genocide is being pushed and pushed and pushed to a point of ultimate extermination, when it looks like life is not viable even in that land. And to talk about Palestine as a whole being freed, and to talk about Masjid Al-Aqsa being a center once again for the believers and people coming back home, seems very audacious, especially at this moment. Because when you're looking at it and you're seeing the images of people on their way out, this is not the time for you to talk about Palestine as a whole and to talk about Al-Aqsa. The same thing could have been thought by the revelation of Surah Al-Hajj, where people come into Mecca saying, Labbaik Allahumma labbaik, and the reality on the ground is that people have fled Mecca because they say La ilaha illallah. That is the revelation of Surah Al-Hajj. The first parts of Surah Al-Hajj are the last warnings in Mecca to those that are persecuting the Muslims. The second part of Surah Al-Hajj, and it's the majority of it, are words to the believers now that they have been expelled and persecuted. And when you think about morale and you think about nostalgia and you think about missing out, it's the most painful time for those who have grown up in Mecca to realize that we may die outside of Mecca and never get to see our homes in Mecca again. And more importantly, never get to see the house of Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala purified once again. It's in this context that Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala reveals, إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُدَافِعُ عَنِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Verily, Allah defends those who believe. Allah is in the defense of those who believe. This is a rich verse. that comes down in Surah Al-Hajj. And a unique verse. إِنَّ اللَّهَ يُدَافِعُ عَنِ الَّذِينَ آمَنُوا. Yudafi'u is different from an-nasr. Nasr, in Tansurullah yansurkum, when we think about the word nasr and victory, it speaks to the outcome. It speaks to the eventual victory that is coming from Allah subhanahu wa ta'ala, the aid of Allah that He has promised that will come, where you eventually find yourself in a place of triumph. Yudafi'u anil ladina amanu means Allah is actively defending the believers right now. Allah is actively protecting those who believe right now.